government officials, deputations. This is the appointed time. Let me call this meeting to order. This is the meeting of the Subcommittee to study matters relating to typhoon shelters and sheltered anchorages. We will hold a public hearing session today. Let's move on to item 1 on the agenda. I will be inviting Mr. Liu, Undersecretary, to deliver opening remarks. Now, deputations, if need be, you can use interpretation service. Channel 0 is floor, channel 1 Cantonese, channel 2 English, and channel 3 Putonghua. And please note the notice placed in front of you. That is a notice for members of the public attending LegCo meetings in the public gallery or in conference rooms of the complex. Please note the security measures, and please be reminded that your speech and your submissions will not be covered under the LegCo Powers and Privileges Ordinance. We only have so much time today. I'll impose a speaking time limit of 4 minutes each. Please be succinct. When the alarm goes off, you will be asked to stop. Following the deputations round, I will invite the administration to give a response, and then the floor will be open for members to put questions. We should have 23 minutes left for a Q&A session. Now I will invite the administration to deliver opening remarks. Over to you. Thank you, Chairman, members, deputations. I'm leading a team of government officials from different government bureaus and departments to attend today's public hearing of the Subcommittee to study matters relating to typhoon shelters and sheltered anchorages to take your views. First of all, I thank the Subcommittee for expressing views and for referring over 20 written submissions to the administration. Earlier, we provided a consolidated response to the views expressed by the public. They include the salient points of an assessment and also the assessment of typhoon shelter space requirements 2022-2035, reviewing the wind protection capacity of typhoon shelters, expansion of typhoon shelters, the latest development of water selling kiosks, promoting recreational fishery, refuse collection services, and also road transport facilities for Aberdeen Typhoon Shelter. The government is committed to ensuring sufficient shelter spaces are provided within Hong Kong waters for local vessels, including working vessels and pleasure vessels, to take refuge during typhoons or inclement weather, so as to safeguard the safety of the vessels and their crew members. There are 14 typhoon shelters providing 243 hectares of shelter space for local vessels. Apart from typhoon shelters, local vessels can also choose to berth at 18 sheltered anchorages. Under normal weather conditions, local vessels may be anchored at safe and suitable locations within Hong Kong waters according to their daily business and operational needs, subject to not causing obstruction to marine traffic. And apart from anchorage areas, then we must also ensure that the passage areas will not be obstructed. We will be happy to listen to the views of deputations. If need be, we can provide our response afterwards, or we can provide a written response after today's meeting. Thank you. The administration is attaching a lot of importance to today's meeting. We have representatives from different bureaus: Transport and Logistics Bureau, Tourism, Culture, Sports Tourism, and Sports Bureau, Energizing Kowloon East, Invigorating Island South Office, Commerce and Economic Development Bureau, as well as the AFCD and Marine Department. We have 20 deputations waiting to speak. Mr. Zimmerman will have the floor now.
Hong Kong can be the water sports capital of the world. We have the longest coastline, 450 kilometers around Kowloon and the New Territories, 700 kilometers around all the islands. We have 263 islands, larger than 500 square meters. Hong Kong has more water surface than land. Over the last 15 years, pleasure vessel fleet grew by 120%. The commercial fleet grew by 7. Pleasure vessels now make up 60% of the local vessels, up from 42. This excludes the explosion of canoes and paddleboards and other water sports equipment. But no new moorings, no new marinas, no new water supply points, no new bilge pumps for sewage. We lack the storage space for water sports equipment on the water. People can't take a boat, canoe or surfboard home in Hong Kong. It won't fit on the minibus. It won't fit on the MTR. We see boats all over Hong Kong under bridges, under trees, on beaches in unsafe waters, difficult to access and exposed to storms and damage. Now the LCSD offers water sports training, but after the kids learn, there's no space for them to own a boat. Now the Marine Department is responsible for safety of vessels and traffic, but has no interest in leisure boating. So both are happy to let the Development Bureau lead. Tung Chung gets a new marina, our proposal originally. Aberdeen Typhoon shelter is made larger in response to our proposal. And Kai Yi Chau will get marinas and a typhoon shelter. But how about Sheko Quarry? How about adding a typhoon shelter at Malu Shiu in the planned reclamation? How about adding a typhoon shelter in Reclamation Area 137 near Cheung Kwan O? How about adding a breakwater at Sai Kung Town Center? How about adding breakwaters to grow the typhoon shelter at Pak Sha Wan in Sai Kung? How about adding a breakwater at Yau Tong Bay to create a typhoon shelter? How about adding landing steps, boat ramps, and a club for boat owners at Area 65 in Cheung Kwan O along the Eastern Channel? How about connecting the Kung Tung Typhoon Shelter with the Ngau Tau Kok MTR station? How about connecting the sports stadium with the approach channel so water sports can be done there? How about connecting the sports stadium with Victoria Harbour for visitors and water taxi? Now, Xi Jinping said lucid waters and lush mountains are invaluable assets for the country. He called for us to promote high-quality development of the marine economy. And now my question is, what are we going to do as Hong Kong? The problem is that we have so many government departments here today, and nobody is in charge. LCSD is not in charge, the Marine Department is not in charge, nobody appears to be in charge when it comes to developing the marine economy of Hong Kong. We have the best city in the world. And when you want people to come here to be happy, you want people to do hello Hong Kong. We got the waters, we got the islands, we got the waterfronts, we got the seas. We can be the best in the world. We are the best in the nation. We can be the best in the world when it comes to water sports. So achieving all of this would be a big win in a city which is short on land and very rich on water. Thank you.
Next, Mr. Choi. Thank you. Before attending today's meeting, I read this letter from the administration, totaling 12 pages, responding to the various views expressed, especially those from the fishery industry. And these suggestions include berthing spaces and landing facilities. But it seems that the government must do more to tackle the issue of typhoon shelters. Now, it seems that they are not responding directly to our requests. For example, at the outset, as I read this paper, I think the government is the government's reply to water selling kiosks is self-serving. Now, according to this assessment report published last year, typhoon shelter space is divided into those for pleasure vessels and those for non-pleasure vessels. Well, basically, for those for working vessels, the berths are taken up by pleasure vessels. But taking this holistic approach, I think this is a fallacy when the government suggests that there is, in fact, sufficient berthing spaces. Take Hailing Chow as an example. This is unique. It is a very remote location. If you ask a vessel to go all the way to that area, this is just too far away. It is unreasonable. I can find similar issues in this reply. I'd like to talk about Tuen Mun now. In page 3 of the administration's reply, titled Optimizing and Providing More Landing Facilities Apart from Aberdeen and Cheung Chau, the former Secretary for Transport and Housing visited Tuen Mun. Several landing steps served several hundred small vessels. Right now, the users need to climb the breakwater. A few years ago, a landing step was provided at Area 27 of Tuen Mun, but this is far from sufficient. Many pleasure crafts in Tuen Mun are unable to enter typhoon shelters because of insufficient space. They are unsafe. They don't even have the right to enter the fishery market because the market is situated exactly within the typhoon shelter. This poses an obstacle to the development of the fishery industry, where there is also this jet foil pier taking up a lot of space, thereby reducing berthing spaces for smaller vessels. It is a waste of the valuable space within typhoon shelters. The government's mindset is so outdated. This is like a car park on a first-come, first-served basis. The government is old-fashioned. The government is not tackling the present-day problems. So in the long run, I think the government should comprehensively review the situation of typhoon shelters across the territory. It must be here to support industry development so that we draw up a blueprint and bring vibrancy to our economy. Instead of implementing stopgap measures, the government can also consider putting in place proper planning, such as invigorating Island South and energizing Kowloon East. Some planning can be put in place for Tuen Mun as well. For example, Tuen Mun Typhoon Shelter can be incorporated into the development of Tuen Mun West. We can also provide facilities to support future industries. Otherwise, I think that even if we wait 50 more years, we won't be able to address the issue.
Mr. Choi Ming-tak, please. Thank you. I have a few questions. First, on SEPA. We have a Guangdong, Hong Kong, Macau individual yacht travel scheme. It is one of the most important driving forces for the future development of the Greater Bay Area. There are multiple measures put in place for the individual yacht travel scheme in many cities under the Greater Bay Area, but the Hong Kong government is indifferent to the issues. I hope that the government can establish a interdepartmental working group. I would also like to ask about the individual yacht travel scheme. If the Marine Department have any plan to take forward the scheme, do we have a plan for one-time approval and multiple entry and exit? There are multiple typhoon shelters that are near the urban area, including the Aberdeen typhoon shelters, and there is an expansion of the typhoon shelter planned under the Invigorating Island South initiative. We use set aside a certain percentage of the berthing areas in the Aberdeen typhoon shelter for yachts coming under the individual visit scheme. My third question, in 2020, there is the Yangtze River Protection Law of the People's Republic of China. Guangdong Province is part of the key management area. Hong Kong is a member of the Greater Bay Area, so we must act accordingly. In Article 73, it says that the State Council should provide subsidy for the development of the marine development. mainland vessels are making use of new energy, but we are lagging behind. I think that we should act in accordance with the Yangtze River Protection Law, and that we should turn our vessels into ones that are using new energy. And we should also subsidize enterprises for them to invest in green transportation. I have one question for the Culture, Sports and Tourism Bureau. We always talk about revitalizing night market. I think that we also have to revitalize the Typhoon shelter. Will the Bureau establish a working group to help the vessels owners or investors to apply for relevant licenses for waterborne restaurants? Thank you. That's all for me. Next, Mr. Wong Yu Ken. Good morning, Chairman. In the 14th five-year plan of our country and the long-term planning of our country for 2035 and the planning principles for Greater Bay Area, it supports Hong Kong's development into an international maritime hub, but the government does not provide enough support for the industry. Typhoon shelters is just one of the components of the industries. We have been talking about this issue of insufficient typhoon shelters. The past assessments did not involve our industry or any trade unions in the industry, and that is regrettable. In the paper, the government says that we have to work with our country in terms of maritime development. The government says that in the paper, but the government did not reach out to us as to whether or not or how we should complement our country's development. For this meeting on typhoon shelters and sheltered anchorages, I'm not sure why the Invigorating Island South and the Energizing Kowloon East initiatives are mentioned in the paper, because it's not really related. Typhoon shelters are for vessels to take refuge. There are dragon boat competitions taking place in the typhoon shelters, but it's not been mentioned in the paper. It seems that the paper is focusing on some wrong areas. For marinas in Causeway Bay, they are happening outside the typhoon shelters. A lot of water sports do not have to make use of typhoon shelters. So why do you put these in the paper? Some people think that 14 typhoon shelters are enough, and the government seems to think so as well. But the typhoon shelters that are suitable for us are only 4, and we don't have enough sheltered anchorages to make use of. For Healing Child typhoon shelters, the vessels over 15 meters or 75 meters can make use of that. But the depth of the waters is insufficient for vessels with overall lengths of 70 meters. The draft is about 6 to 7 meters. The Healing Child typhoon shelters depth is not enough for the use of those vessels. For vessels over 70 meters in length, the government does not allow the constructions of those vessels because Hong Kong does not have enough typhoon shelters to cater to these vessels of 70 meters in length. That restricts our development. For large-scale works on sea, they are mostly done by overseas contractors. That takes away the opportunities of our local contractors. I hope that the government can attach importance to that. Thank you. Next, Mr. Wong Chun Wink. Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon. I would like to talk about New Yamate Typhoon Shelter. It's the most used typhoon shelters in Hong Kong. There are a lot of vessels taking refuge in New Yamate typhoon shelters. For large barges, they have difficulties entering the New Yamate typhoon shelters, so they have to park outside or berth outside the typhoon shelters. During inclement weather, I hope that the Rambler Channel and the Chen Sawan area outside New Yamate typhoon shelters can be opened for works vessels so that they can take refuge. I have another suggestion. I hope that the government can explore setting up a new typhoon shelters near the airport and the artificial islands. For vessels over 75 meters long, they have nowhere to berth in any typhoon shelters because Hailing Chow typhoon shelters only allow vessels that are shorter than 75 meters to berth. So vessels over 75 meters in length have nowhere to take refuge. The government suggests that we berth our vessels in the mainland. Do you think that is reasonable? I don't think so. We have to do long-term planning for typhoon shelters. For Class 4 vessels in 2020 to 2022, the yearly growth is about 10%. And the newly built pleasure vessels are mostly over 100 feet. They are making larger and larger pleasure vessels. But at the same time, do you have more and more berthing places in typhoon shelters for the development of pleasure vessels? I think that the government should plan ahead. In Kaoichao artificial islands, the government should establish a typhoon shelter to meet the future demand. Because there is growing demand for berthing places. In northwestern part of Tuen Mun, we only have a typhoon shelter. When the Tuen Mun typhoon shelter is full, the members of the industry can only berth their vessels at Area 44. So I hope that a breakwaters can be built at Area 44 in Tuen Mun. That's all for me. Thank you. Next, Mr. Kun Siu Fai. Thank you, Chairman. I would like to thank the Chairman and the LegCo members for facing this issue squarely. The problems with typhoon shelters have been here for over 20 years. We only have such a waters for us with limited area. Because of the problems with the policy, we have a growing number of yachts. The government is not forward-looking enough in planning ahead for or to cater to the growth of vessels. I hope that different government departments can work together to solve the issue, because for, say, typhoon shelters in Aberdeen, it does not only serve the function of typhoon shelters. They serve purposes of tourism, maritime, selling of seafood and fish. We should make use of the typhoon shelter to its full extent, and we don't have relevant legislation to take forward the purposes of the typhoon shelter. When law enforcement agencies come to the typhoon shelters, they have no legislation to act on. The government engaged 2 consultants to make a report or assessment, but nothing could be done. I heard that the consultant had difficulties in coming up with the solutions because there were a lot of premises set. I hope that the government should engage a credible consultant to make an assessment to solve the management and berthing spaces of typhoon shelters so that the consultant can identify the best solution for the problem. Because sometimes the electrical may not be able to identify a solution by itself. So maybe you need to engage a consultant. I also suggest the privatization of typhoon shelters. We can make the vessels who want to berth at the typhoon shelters pay. If we can come up with a price with the consensus of the industry, then I think that we can solve the problem. For the rent of the link REIT is not agreed by a lot of the vendors who are renting the malls. So if we can agree on a rate, then I don't think that there will be any conflict. Typhoon shelters and vessels are important driving force for our economy. If we can develop vessels or pleasure vessels, we can have them parked in the new territories because the scene is very beautiful there. So water activities can take place there. So marina club should not be an no-go area. If it's beneficial to the economy, I think that we should allow people to run marina clubs. As a fisherman, the ocean is only so large. If it affects the livelihood of the fishermen, then I think that we should tackle the problem. Thank you.
Next, Ms. Zhang Huayi. Thank you, Chairman, members. I represent Thaipac Seafood Company Limited. I'd like to express our views here. We are all familiar with the Jumbo restaurant. Now, this is the only restaurant left floating on the waters of Hong Kong. We strive to make improvements, and please also consider the idea of typhoon shelter tourism. In short, you should enhance supporting transport to bring in more people to the area. You should also beautify the landscape of typhoon shelters to make the place more attractive. Because we want to abide by this principle of promoting tourism, like Jumbo Seafood Restaurant. So you need to provide parking for not only any vehicle but tourist coaches to support tourism. And you should also consider enhancing information dissemination to support typhoon tourism. That's all. Mr. Leung Chee-yen. Thank you. I don't think the government is catering to the needs of the trade. I'm disappointed. For example, during typhoon and inclement weather, we can't find suitable locations in a timely manner to berth the vessels. We are left to survive on our own. According to the Hong Kong Polytechnic University's report, for Class 2 vessels, 220 spaces would be required. But for New Yamate, To Kwa Wan, and Tuen Mun typhoon shelters altogether, only 136 hectares would be available instead of over 200. That shows a severe shortage for our trade. Regarding A17 public cargo working area, I find it problematic because I want to know whether A17 is a proper anchorage area, because the government has not informed the trade before changing the use of A17. It's no longer a sheltered space. Vessels cannot get in. The other problem is The government has changed the use of A17 for the purpose of accommodating pleasure crafts. We are afraid that there will be more to come. And if this is a precedent, the trade is concerned about the availability of typhoon shelters and their business environment. About Kwun Tong typhoon shelter and illegal occupation, Kwun Tong Typhoon Shelter spans 33.8 hectares. Usually, the typhoon shelter is occupied by working vessels, but because of acquisition of a private area, instead of having more berthing spaces, private moorings are available, only that an exorbitant sum would be charged. This goes against the principle of establishing typhoon shelters, that is to provide shelter space for vessels during typhoons. A pilot scheme was implemented in 2018 for Kwun Tong Typhoon Shelter to accommodate non-pleasure vessels. On the southern side, this is designated for non-pleasure vessels. But still, there are illegal berthing. In 2022, 225 such vessels have berthed there, doubled the number in previous years. Day in, day out, we see pleasure crafts berthed in a typhoon shelter. The pilot scheme is ineffective as the government turns a blind eye to the problem. To address the issue of To Kwa Wan Typhoon Shelter, To Kwa Wan Typhoon Shelter is the smallest typhoon shelter in Hong Kong, only 14.8 hectares. Now, because of illegal occupation of berths in Kwun Tong Typhoon Shelter, many smaller working vessels are forced to go to To Kwa Wan. In recent years, a dozen vessels have idled in To Kwa Wan Typhoon Shelter. They are either sunken or capsized. According to the government's information, there are a dozen of them. To ensure navigational safety, we've asked the relevant government department to salvage the relevant wreckage. There are also some 10 barges berthed near the embankment of typhoon shelters. They are subject to high winds. The wave walls should be added to the existing breakwater. I'm sorry, I've heard the fourth point, but your time is up. Next, Mr. Lai Tai Fok. Thank you, Chairman. Everyone, good afternoon. I am engaged in the business of leasing Class 4 pleasure crafts. We don't have sufficient berthing space for Class 4 vessels. If we want to apply for a berth, we need to wait for at least 10 years to no avail. Now, for our business, many of us were once fishermen. So we could only find whatever anchorage we could. We are accused of taking up the typhoon shelter space. Well, for Class 4 vessels, we actually support the development of tourism in Hong Kong. We attract mainland as well as overseas tourists. More berths should be provided so that young people would find our trade profitable. If we can attract new blood to our trade, we can help support the development of tourism in Hong Kong. I think we should work it out with the government to tackle the issue of shortage of berthing spaces, because right now it's nothing but talk shop. Thank you. Next, Mr. Wong Yan Hong, Chairman, everyone, good afternoon. I'll be very succinct. Well, I was a fisherman since my adolescence. Now I'm in the leasing of pleasure craft business, and I helped dispatching ferries for some infrastructure projects. Now, in the past, fishermen were cooperative. The fairways were left clear of blockage, but now I think things have commercialized. Say, if I take up one space, no one else can be accommodated nearby. That's how it works. But we used to have the team spirit. We would accommodate each other's needs. But now people would illegally occupy the berths so as to make a profit. I think that draws our attention. You should also take note of this. Now, for Causeway Bay Typhoon Shelter, I also applied that fairway. I can tell you, this fairway cannot accommodate 2 vessels at the same time. You should take a look for yourselves. Can the fairway accommodate a fireboat? I understand that some renovations have recently been made at the Typhoon Shelter, but I am concerned about this the commercial activities there. Now, for Kwun Tong Typhoon Shelter, you have zones A, B, and C with no change in the size of the Typhoon Shelter. Now we have bigger fishing boats. They are longer and bigger, but the Typhoon Shelter is not getting larger. I look forward to new developments of typhoon shelters in Hong Kong. Well, Mr. Wong, I think you are being very generous when you say that they are engaged in commercial activities. Next, Mr.
Chairman and LegCo members for taking this topic. I'm in agreement that we definitely need more typhoon shelters in Hong Kong. One of the reasons is that the industry is growing, and the lack of mooring spaces and lack of proper facilities is just making the industry stuck. And there's a big potential of large employment that is not happening because of lack of typhoon shelters. And of course, there is a lot of illegal occupation of some spaces and people charging a lot of rents for the space. And I'm sure you guys will think of a very good solution. And I thank you for listening. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Next, Mr. Lawrence Chow.
Committee and members of the various government departments. I'm Lawrence, the chair of the Hong Kong Boating Industry Association, representing 55 members of various sectors of the pleasure boat industry, ranging from yacht brokers, charter vessels, marinas, and surveyors, just to name a few. Hong Kong is a pleasure boat haven with over 200 islands and a beautiful coastline, making recreational boating very popular and accessible. We are one of the leading pleasure boat markets in the whole of Asia, and as we develop this, because we've developed this through building a very strong pleasure boating culture. The pleasure boat industry in Hong Kong is fast growing, as reflected with the number of pleasure vessels. Over the past 20 years, the number of vessels have almost tripled from 4,515 to 12,378 in 2022. However, our industry is facing significant challenges to grow over the past decade, as there have not been any new marina developments or significant increases of moorings. The lack of sheltered mooring spaces in relation to the increased number of pleasure vessels is one of the main reasons why the typhoon shelters are so crowded. Although there is plenty of mooring spaces in Hailing Chow, it is not ideal for pleasure vessels, as we've heard today. Hailing Chow is too far, and there's no ferry there. There's no security in the area, making it easy for theft. There's no fresh water supply for drinking or washing the boats. There's no sewage disposal areas. There's no shop or catering establishments. There's simply no infrastructure there. For these reasons, it is extremely difficult to incentivize vessels of all classes to moor in Hailing Chow or find boat crew in that area. Therefore, we do applaud the government for expanding the Aberdeen Typhoon Shelter, as it will create more space for accessible moorings and open up the fairways for better safety. We believe designated mooring areas for pleasure vessels, fishing vessels, and commercial vessels should help improve the shelter. We also appreciate the Marine Department's pilot scheme of exclusive mooring vessels at Kwun Tong. However, this should be looked at in more detail. We agree that the commercial vessels and pleasure vessels should be separated, as mooring a pleasure vessel of fiberglass next to a stainless steel or steel vessel is bound to cause problems. By allowing moorings in that area, it could increase government revenue. Two, it could also regulate the position and sizes of the vessels using the shelter, and it can create a safe fairway for all users. We believe the scheme should be enforced and developed further with pleasure vessels in mind. Although Aberdeen and Kwun Tong Typhoon Shelter crowding issues are sort of being addressed, we believe there are still opportunities. I think Paul has mentioned this earlier, but I'll mention just a few. Hebe Haven could definitely benefit from an typhoon shelter, breakwater out front to help minimize the impact of typhoons, as we've seen in Typhoon Mangkhut that have destroyed lots of pleasure vessels and the coastline there. So this could potentially increase the number of moorings in the area and protect the waterfront and help regulate the boats in there. Overall, it's important to allocate more shelter mooring spaces for pleasure vessels that are separate from commercial vessels to avoid overcrowding and also potential damage during typhoons. Breakwaters, waterfront, and marina developments could also act as buffers from typhoons, whilst providing more shelter water mooring spaces. Thanks.
Right. Thank you. 下一位張兆強。
Next, Mr. Chen Xiukan, please. Thank you, Chairman. I would also like to thank the LegCo members for attaching importance to the issues relating to typhoon shelters and sheltered anchorages. Hong Kong Fishermen Youth Association made a written submission, and the Hong Kong Fishermen Consortium also made a written submission. I would like to add something. The current typhoon shelters are not enough to cater to the needs of the development of Hong Kong. The management is rather rough, and that is not beneficial to the marine development of Hong Kong. We have such a good harbor for leisure fishing, sightseeing. We can develop these areas. The government or the mainland authorities also promote the development of quality marine economy. We can make use of the typhoon shelters for such development. Second, there is insufficient berths at typhoon shelters. I've had meetings with the government for over the past decades. The government always said that there is enough berths in typhoon shelters. They always ask us to berth our vessels at Hailing Chow typhoon shelters. They said that there are berths there, but the ancillary facilities are insufficient in Hailing Chow typhoon shelters. If I berth my vessels there, I have no way to go back to my home. They have no ancillary facilities whatsoever there. Should I just swim home? I think that is not appropriate for the government to just look at the figures. I have had meetings with government multiple times. The typhoon shelters always assign berths on a first come, first served basis. When we have so many vessels, it's very difficult for us to berth our vessels. We should sit down to discuss the issues. Only a few typhoon shelters have designation of berthing spaces or areas. I don't want to see accidents or fatalities in typhoon shelters, and the government should not wait until then to act on the issues. I hope that there could be destination of berthing areas in typhoon shelters. And also, the wind protection capacity is insufficient in typhoon shelters. The breakwaters are not tall enough under inclement weathers. We've had a Mangkhut and Typhoon Hato. We should increase the height of the breakwaters. They've been talking about this for a number of years. We should build a overlapping breakwaters in Aberdeen typhoon shelters. They've been talking about it for a number of years, but it's not been built. Also, there is insufficient landings. When I went to the mainland, they have this finger type pier there. When the vessels are not parked or berthed appropriately, it wastes the spaces in the typhoon shelters. Also, we don't have enough fresh waters in typhoon shelters. There is insufficient ancillary facilities in typhoon shelters. We also have to have electricity charging facilities. Also, on waste collection charging, and how should we handle or process the waste oil that we collect? Should we just dispose them in the waters? Thank you. Next, Mr. Kwok Wai Hong. Thank you, Chairman. We are Hong Kong and Kowloon Motor Boats and Tugboats Association. We are a trade organization. Our members cover ferries, kaito, tugboats, towage, harbor cleansing, and marine works. We have over 400 vessels in terms of our membership. Our vessels serve members of the public in Hong Kong. Before citizens wake up, we went out onto the oceans to serve them. During typhoon, our vessels serve the public, and only when the residents get home can we go back to sleep. We have a number of typhoon number 8, and I think that this first come first served mechanism is unfair to us in typhoon shelters, because the vessels serving the public can only go to the typhoon shelters after they have finished with their service. So they are unable to get the berthing space in typhoon shelters. I hope that the government can set aside some berths for vessels that are serving the public so that we can take refuge under inclement weather. The Marine Department engaged the Polytechnic University to conduct this assessment of the typhoon shelter space requirements 2022 to 2035. The different classes of vessels have different characteristics, which affect their berthing requirements. The report does not mention the factors concerning the size or conditions of the typhoon shelters, because there are some floating objects and wreckage. And before conducting the assessment, the government did not conduct any face-to-face consultation with the industry in terms of the future development and the trend of the size of the vessels. They are not covered in the report. So I think that the report of the assessment does not reflect the reality. In 2018, the Marine Department implemented a pilot non-pleasure vessel berthing area scheme to designate different berthing areas for different vessels. So pleasure vessels park or berth at the south sides, and all types of vessel berth at the north sides of the Typhoon or Kunton typhoon shelters, so that different types of vessels can enjoy a fair share of the typhoon shelter. But since the implementation of the pilot scheme is not effective, some berths are occupied for a long time, and some people make use of public resources to profit. The government officials have no enforcement power. They can only advise the non-complying vessels operators. Since the middle of this year, the government designate different berthing areas for different vessels in the Aberdeen West Typhoon Shelter on a one-year trial. But we don't see a comprehensive plan yet. So it is difficult to straighten out the current problem of berths in the Aberdeen shelter that is in short supply. According to the latest records of the Marine Department, there are a total of 11 wrecks or semi-floating vessels in the Tokawan Typhoon shelters. There are 5 more since the records. So the safety and the berths are reduced in Tokawan Typhoon shelters. Thank you. Next, Miss Sandy Mack, please. Thank you. I think that the government should resume all the typhoon shelters and lease them out. I'm concerned about Kaito services. We have nowhere to berth. That's my 2 points. I think that the government should resume all the berthing spaces and lease them out and charge us fees. The situation in Kunton is especially serious. When there is typhoon, the Kaito ferries are unable to berth there. Thank you. Next, Mr. Chang Kyu-yeon. Thank you, Chairman. I hope that the government can attach importance to allocation of berths for Kaito and ferry services. Thank you. Next, Mr. Chow Yu-kei. Good afternoon, Chairman, government officials, and members. I represent Two Moon Offshore Fishermen's Association. Let me talk about the situation in Two Moon. Among the 14 typhoon shelters, the one in Two Moon is a rather large one. For vessels that is shorter than 15 meters, they can enter the Two Moon typhoon shelters. So there are many different classes of vessels in the Two Moon typhoon shelters. During normal days, there is no problem with berthing, but at the end of the year, during fishing moratorium, there are limited berthing spaces. During fishing moratorium for pleasure vessels and commercial vessels, they come to the typhoon shelters to berth on a first-come, first-served basis. There is no management of the berths. When the vessels come back or the fishing boats come back, they have no place to berth. Because the berths are allocated on a first-come, first-served basis. When the boats are berthed on a scattered manner, it's quite difficult for the fish boats. When the 200 fish boats come back after fishing moratorium, they barely have enough berths for them. I grew up in Two Moon myself. I was a fisherman myself. The fishing boats used to be very small, and now it's getting larger and larger. So when we build a fishing vessels, we just ask the government official to examine it, and then we can sail the vessels, regardless of the materials of the vessels. Usually vessels can be used for a long time. That is why we have such a significant growth in the number of vessels. When the vessels are not parked together, then it will become a very messy typhoon shelter. when the vessels are parked near the fairways, the Marine Department come to attach a notice on the vessels. I have an idea. Now the third runway project was over. Some barges had left. I'm not sure if the barges outside the new Yamate typhoon shelters were berthed legally. For large boats or barges, can they be berthed outside the typhoon shelters? Because sometimes the barges are berthed there and there is no one on the vessel. For fishermen, they stay on the boats and they have to drive their boats in and out of the typhoon shelters. So it will be more convenient for them if they can have their vessels inside the typhoon shelters. There are 2 ponds in Tumun. For ice dispensing and fish selling vessels, they are unable to enter the large ponds. The issues with the fish harvesting and ice dispensing, if they cannot be solved, how can the fishermen make their living? Thank you. Next, Mr. Lo Kwon Choi. Thank you, Chairman. For Tolo Harbor, Samon Chai, there is only 1 typhoon shelter. That is far from enough. During the recent typhoons, the fishing boats were berthed at the typhoon shelters. Because of typhoon, some mainland vessels also came to the typhoon shelters. When the typhoon got worse, there are many fishing vessels that entered the typhoon shelters. And when the small boats want to enter, sometimes the fairways or passage areas were blocked by large vessels. Can the Marine Department plan for, say, different berthing areas for vessels of different sizes? We do have berthing spaces in the typhoon shelters, but the vessels are occupying the berths randomly. Sometimes large vessels owners make use of small boats to just occupy the berths to save the space for the large vessels that are to come. I think that the Marine Department can plan or make better planning for berthing spaces. In August, there was a fire that broke out in a vessel. The firemen could not reach the boats and they could only stand at the pier because in Typhoon, there is not a fireboat that is suitable for putting out that fire. So when the firemen came, they could not put out the fire on that vessel. Can we have a fireboat standby at Tolo Harbor? When fire broke out at fish rafts, and sometimes the fire lasts all night. But there was not a single fireboat that could put out the fire in an hour. That is very ironic because Hong Kong is such an advanced city. I don't think that it's very difficult for the government to put in place such facilities for fire saving. There is also a refuge issues and for boarding and disembarking of people. Can we put in place some pontoons there for people to board the vessels? Can the Marine Department allow people to put small boats near the shore so that they will not occupy the central area of the typhoon shelter and that the mainland vessels can also berth in the typhoon shelters when there is typhoon? Thank you.
之後應
Next, last speaker, Mr. Wan Chiu Hua. Chairman, members, good afternoon. We've experienced more and more serious typhoons nowadays, like Typhoon Mangkhut. I couldn't get in the typhoon shelter as a result. So imagine if we encounter more typhoons of this strength. Now I will invite the administration to give a response before I throw open the floor for members to ask questions. If you'd like to speak, you should press the button. I will allow each member roughly 5 minutes, give or take. Oh, instead of pressing the button, if you want to speak, just put up your hand. Under Secretary, when you're ready, please respond to the views expressed. Thank you, Chairman. Some 20 deputations just expressed their views. I think we already noted some of the views before. In fact, we already provided a reply in our written response. Now, what is heard loud and clear is that although overall speaking, in terms of the size of typhoon shelters or the number of berths, there is no general shortage. But for some popular typhoon shelters, as pointed out by deputations and organizations, there is a shortage. Now, we've heard you loud and clear. For typhoon shelters within the harbor, because of the Harbor Protection Ordinance, we are posed with this challenge if we want to expand the typhoon shelter. Instead, we should optimize the management of typhoon shelters and optimize the use of existing resources. Now, we are sparing no effort, especially now that we've noted your comments. We will strive for improvement. For other issues relating to specific typhoon shelters, I think it's quite difficult to give an overall response here. We need to tackle them one by one. But in fact, we've heard views from different sectors. I have a big team today. Perhaps if necessary, I can invite other government departments to give a response. Marine Department can. Right, but they made a number of points. For example, people using public resources to make a profit, the unavailability of fireboats, and some deputations mentioned the lack of freshwater supply. So perhaps you can make use of this opportunity to explain to deputations and the public what you have been doing, Marine Department. Thank you, Chairman. About the demand and supply of typhoon shelters, let me just quote some figures. We conducted the last round of assessment of typhoon shelter space requirements 2022 to 2035. We engaged a consultant to tap the views of ship owners. And in fact, the survey covered 50% of all ship owners in Hong Kong. Some deputations just now mentioned that they were not consulted in the exercise. In fact, we also carried on the consultation with the local vessel advisory committee. As for the remaining ship owners, perhaps in the next round, we will strive to incorporate their comments to make sure that their views are heard in the next exercise. Now, on typhoon shelters in the past years, indeed, some typhoon shelters were quite popular and the utilization reached 100%. But as of mid-October, say To Kwa Wan, New Yau Ma Tei, typhoon shelters, the utilization went above 90%. For Kwun Tong, it's 90%. And for Tuen Mun, some 80%. So at this stage, we don't see any typhoon shelter going beyond the capacity. For Typhoon Koh-i-Noor and Saola, when typhoons signal number 9 and 10 were hoisted, not a typhoon shelter reached 100% capacity. So that's the situation. As for the measures to be put in place, some deputations mentioned in new development projects, whether new typhoon shelters can be provided, such as the Kaoyichao artificial islands. We'll talk to the Development Bureau and the CEDD about this. Another measure we plan to introduce is as follows. While drawing on the experience of the third runway project, some working vessels took shelter within the site area during typhoons. So we are considering whether the same arrangements can be put in place for the artificial islands project. This is beneficial because larger vessels would not have to go all the way to one of our typhoon shelters, so that space can be made available for other needy vessels. As for the management of typhoon vessels, typhoon shelters, the berthing spaces, availability of power supply and water, I'll defer to Director Law. Thank you. Passage areas are delineated from the berthing spaces within the 14 typhoon shelters. To ensure proper berthing of vessels within the typhoon shelters, we conduct patrols round the clock to ensure navigational safety of the passage areas, so that during emergency, emergency rescue boats can reach the area without blockage. So we will ensure that the passage areas and the fairways are not subject to any blockage. We also take note of the berthing situation of vessels, see whether any vessel has capsized, whether there is any leakage or the fire hazard. If need be, we will rectify the situation and take follow-up action, including investigation of the relevant ship owners. About larger vessels in typhoon shelters, as at the end of 2022, we have 20,752 local vessels in Hong Kong. For larger vessels, 15 vessels had exceeded 75 meters in length. And now for those exceeding 75 meters in length, in 2022, we only have 15 instead of 20 in previous years. For larger vessels, they are built according to the ocean-going vessel standards. In terms of seaworthiness, during typhoons, they would opt for open waters to take a shelter where the seabed is where the water is deeper, and the Marine Department will also stipulate as one of the licensing conditions for operational vessels to leave the leave the waters of Hong Kong during typhoons. I'd also like to report on the wreckage in To Kwa Wan Typhoon Shelter. We learned from the trade that there was a suspected case of wreckage in To Kwa Wan Typhoon Shelter. We arranged for divers to conduct investigation on the 24th of July. According to the report we received, at 7 locations, 8 wrecked vessels were found. In accordance with CAP 56, we published in the Gazette these 8 sunken vessels details. We are consulting the Department of Justice for legal advice on follow-up action. But in fact, recently we have identified 15 wreckages. We'll go by the Merchant Shipping Ordinance to handle the wreckage. To ensure navigational safety, we have marked the area of the wreckage with pontoons to remind coxswains to be careful when plying through the fairways. About refuge collection and the collection of waste oil, as mentioned by one of the deputations, We understand that refuse and waste oil will be generated in the course of the vessel's activities, and we have refuse collectors taking up this task, and we are discussing with the relevant departments on enhancing the operational arrangements. Details will be announced in a timely manner. Now that's about collecting refuse. On collecting waste oil, the marine refuse collection contractor service does not include the collection of waste oil, because waste oil is considered class 3 dangerous goods, which is a flammable substance. Now in other words, there is no outsourced contract on the collection of class 3 dangerous goods. We will explore the feasibility of including this service in the next contract. Thank you. Any other government department would like to respond on the Secretary? Now, about expansion of Aberdeen Typhoon shelter and the size, may I see if the head of Invigorating Island South would like to respond, please? Ms. Au? Thank you, Chairman. The Aberdeen Typhoon Shelter expansion is a project under our office. In light of the strong demand in Aberdeen for sheltered spaces, we'd like to take forward this project to support tourism and recreational development in Southern District in line with the objective of the Invigorating Island South initiative. Our plan at this moment is to expand the Aberdeen Typhoon Shelter by 24 sectors, including the passage areas in the southern side of the Typhoon Shelter. Now, some deputations mentioned the strong demand from pleasure crafts. We believe upon expansion, Aberdeen Typhoon Shelter will provide a great opportunity to cater for the needs of pleasure vessels. Anything else from the Undersecretary? No. All right, the floor is open. I think that they will be asking a lot of questions from Mr. Frankie Yik and Mr. Benson Look, and then I'll be the third to speak, and also Mr. Perry Yu. All right, so I'll be the fourth. I'll give each member 5 minutes. We start with Mr. Frankie Yik.
Thank you, Chairman. There are two parts to my questions. First, after hearing from the deputations, I have some follow-up questions. First, it was put by Mr. Zimmerman. He has collected some figures, and he recommends that some areas could be designated as typhoon shelters or storage space. I visited some harborfront areas. I think that there are two places that are suitable, including the southern area of the Cross Bay Link. I think that a marina club could be established there in Cheng Kwan O. Also at Yau Tong Bay. We can turn the place into a water sports recreational club. I'm not familiar with all the waterfront areas, but visited those two places, and I think that the government can consider these two places, especially when we have the Deputy Head of Energizing Kowloon East office here. My second question, Mr. Wong Yu Kan mentioned this. It was the first time I'm hearing it. I understand that there is restrictions of vessels' length in different typhoon shelters, and I learned that for vessels over 70 meters in length, they could not enter any typhoon shelters, and the government says that we should no longer build any vessels that are longer than 70 meters. I think that the government is avoiding the problem. We used to have small private cars, and now we have larger and larger private cars. For ocean-going vessels, they should be large enough to harvest enough fish. And the government says that we should not build large vessels because they have no space for them to take shelters. I hope that the government can respond to this point. Mr. Kun Siu-Fai said that we should engage a consultant to conduct a more comprehensive assessment. We don't need that. We've heard your views and we know how to take that forward. We don't need any consultant. We should just sit down with you. Another thing that I've noticed is that Mr. Kwok from the Hong Kong Kowloon Motorboats and Tugboats Association mentioned it, that Kaito and ferry services have to serve the members of the public during Typhoon number 8. And I only realized that you do not have a designated berths for your boats. That is a huge problem, Secretary. Where should they berth their vessels? I think that there is a problem with it. I think that in terms of management, the government has to reserve space for them to berth their vessels after Typhoon number 8 and after they've served the members of the public. Apart from these 4 questions, I have noticed something very different or special. The delegations say that we don't have enough typhoon shelters or berths, and that the government said that we do have enough berthing spaces, and there is not a single typhoon shelters that go beyond their capacity during Typhoon number 8. I wonder who is right. And I see that the government is designating different berthing areas through administrative management approach. But some areas are occupied by pleasure vessels, and sometimes the works vessel take up a large spots, and sometimes smaller boats do not dare park or berth near them. Sometimes the government issues letters asking the works vessels to park or berth elsewhere. Is this what the government should do? I think that the government should instead legislate and empower the Director of Marine to designate berthing areas. Otherwise, the problems as mentioned by the delegations would occur. And sometimes the boats are berthed in a very scattered manner. And the government mentioned that the consultant did the assessment in a very objective manner, and I wonder how objective it is. And I don't think that the Healing Chow Typhoon Shelter should be taken into account, because you have to consider the occupancy rate of different typhoon shelters. If Healing Chow is that convenient, then people would have gone there or berthed their vessels there. Thank you. Mr. Yik has 5 questions. I will give you 2 minutes to make a response. Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Mr. X, for his question. There are a few questions relating to the Marine Department's management of typhoon shelters. I will defer to the Marine Department to take that question. As for legislation, the trial run on designating different berthing areas has only gone on for a year, and depending on the results, we will not rule out legislation. Thank you. Before Marine Department make a response, let me add this. There's a suggestion on creating a water sports recreational club in different areas. When we receive such comments, we will refer such recommendations to relevant departments. Mr. Law, Assistant Director of the Marine Department, please. Thank you for your question. First, on restrictions of vessels length. As mentioned in my response earlier, when license is issued to certain vessels for the purpose of navigational safety, we consider where the vessel should go during typhoon. For all of the typhoon shelters, they have a restrictions for vessels length of 75 meters. For vessels that are longer than that, arrangements will have to be made for the vessels to take refuge. For ocean-going vessels, they are rather large. So during typhoon, they mostly go to unobstructed oceans to take refuge. In the coming future, as mentioned by the chairman, because of the third runway project in Tuen Mun, the Tuen Mun Typhoon Shelter's occupancy rate was very high. For large-scale works, we will explore allowing large vessels to lay moorings at work site to alleviate the pressure of the typhoon shelters during typhoon, so that vessels can take refuge in typhoon shelters to enhance marine safety. For the Kaiwichao Artificial Islands, similar arrangement will be made. Mr. Yik have many questions. I will give you time to answer his other questions later. Thank you. As Secretary has said, you said that you will not rule out legislation. Actually, we have followed up on the issue for 5 to 6 years. I think that you should legislate as soon as possible. For the length restriction of 75 meters, I think that you should send a message to the industry. Will you allow for the construction of such vessels in the future? Because the industry will have to consider it before building any vessels. If you have more or better ancillary facilities in Healing Chow typhoon shelters, then you can accommodate longer vessels. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. We have over 10 government officials here in this public hearing to hear from the industry. So I had been looking forward to this hearing, but it seems that the government is unable to respond to the comments or questions. I hope that the government can respond to my questions directly. We have so many members from the trade and industry here, and they have a consensus on the problems. That is the insufficient berths in typhoon shelters for fishing boats and commercial vessels. They share the same problem. In the assessment of typhoon shelter space requirements report, it says that we have enough typhoon shelters. I think that the other members had put a very good analogy. We should not be parking at Yuen Long if we work in Causeway Bay, and we should not ask the vessels to berth at the Healing Chow typhoon shelters because they are very far from urban area. And the government says that the occupancy rate of certain typhoon shelters is only 90%. I share the same question with Mr. Ik. How come the members of the industry say that there is not enough berths in typhoon shelters and the government says that there are enough? Does it have to do with the size or the length of the vessels? I hope that the government can directly tell us is it the case that the government or the industry has made the wrong calculations. There are some representatives from the fishing industry saying that there should be improvement to facilities in typhoon shelters for fresh water supply, electricity charging facilities, and berths for small boats. Can you help the industry? Thank you. The report mentioned by the Marine Department is here. Should the Undersecretary or the Marine Department take the question? Marine Department. Mr. Law, please. Thank you. Let me share with you the calculation of typhoon shelter space. In the report on the assessment of typhoon shelter space requirements is included in the Annex 6 of our reply. The Marine Department assess the need of typhoon shelter space regularly. Let me share with you how we calculate that. First, we have to assess the demand. We engage a consultant to reach out to the vessel's owner in the licensing system to learn about their patterns of berthing, their vessels. The sampling is representative. After we learned of the berthing habit or patterns of vessels owners, we engaged the Polytechnic University to assess the need or patterns of berthing of vessels owner. They also take into account the size of the vessels under our licensing system. The government officials does not have to elaborate or detail on the report. It's included in the paper. A lot of the users of the typhoon shelters say that there is not enough typhoon shelters, but then you say, or the government says that the occupancy rate is only 90%. Please do not repeat what's on the paper. I do have the report tabled in front of me. The question is very simple. The industry says that there is not enough typhoon shelter berthing spaces, and you say that there is enough. Please answer the question directly. Thank you.
Now, just looking at the number of berths, according to this report, we have sufficient number of berths. For our Marine Department colleagues, we have officers dispatched to typhoon shelters to make sure everything is in order during typhoons. They make reports to their supervisors once every few hours on the berthing situation. As explained just now, during Typhoon Saola, the typhoon shelters were not fully utilized. That's because the Marine Department colleagues who were on duty put in place proper arrangements for vessels to be berthed there. Now, for Tuen Mun, the utilization was 88%, probably because the third one-way project had already concluded. The Marine Department colleagues inspected the typhoon shelters and found that some berths were still available. Right, I think we'll stop here and wait for next round of questions. Mr. Perry Yu. Thank you, Chairman. Let me thank the 20 deputations for coming and expressing their views. Well, it's really inspiring, because it never occurred to me that there are so many problems with the management of typhoon shelters. I mean, in the past, for Kwun Tong Typhoon Shelter, now it wasn't heavily utilized, but now it's almost always full. Has it to do with a drastic increase in the number of vessels, or has it to do with management after all? I think it's the latter. Like Mr. Frankie Yik said, I think the legislation aspect is outdated. We must catch up. I'm referring to legislation because in the paper, there is a paragraph on tackling illegal occupation of berths in typhoon shelters. And I'm concerned about pleasure vessels being used for other purposes. 17 cases involved pleasure vessels being used as guest houses. But despite the successful prosecutions, the offenders were fined respectively $500 to $1,000 each. So that's about the rate of a hotel room for one night. This is no deterrence to speak of. If you invoke this piece of legislation to go after the operator of pleasure vessels, it doesn't serve any deterrence. And this is just one of the many examples. You should consider giving an overhaul to the legal framework. In terms of the issue surrounding typhoon shelters, before you put in place a legal framework, you need to have better management. Otherwise, we see cases of illegal occupations and illegal activities, and it's very unfair. For ferries, kaitos, they provide passenger services up to the very last minute for the public. And yet when typhoon strikes, these vessels cannot find any place to take refuge. So I think you should designate some spaces to make sure that these important vessels can take refuge during typhoons. The other point is I am all for blue tourism, so to speak. We have a beautiful harbor. We have many beautiful coastline, beaches along the coastline. We have over 200 islands. But we don't have any blueprint for marine tourism. We have distinct characteristics of the fishery industry. We have a distinct typhoon shelter culture. This is something tourists would be fond of. So I think the government departments should join hands and make sure you include tourism in the process. Now about the visiting pleasure crafts scheme in the Greater Bay Area, I think this is included in the national plan, but we don't have information as to the progress and whether Hong Kong is ready. May I know more details? Undersecretary, thank you for the comments about legislation. I've heard Mr. Frankie Yik and Mr. Yu loud and clear on a cross-boundary pleasure craft travel scheme in the Greater Bay Area. Perhaps I'll defer to the Assistant Director. And that's called the Guangdong Hong Kong Macau Individual Yacht Travel Scheme. We've heard the views of the trade and will continue to maintain liaison. Now about using pleasure vessels in the typhoon shelters for other non-pleasure vessel purposes, we mount joint operations and conduct inspections within the typhoon shelters and take necessary enforcement actions against offenders. I think the member just referred to the outcome of our enforcement action. Apart from invoking the existing legislation, all local vessels, including floating barges and otherwise, can stay in the typhoon shelter, and the floating barges can provide charging and other services to the vessels without breaking the law. Now, this is an arrangement between the service provider and the ship owners within the typhoon shelters. Just last week, together with the WSD and the EMSD, we mounted a joint operation in Tuen Mun Typhoon Shelter to check if there was any illegal connection to the power grid and the water supply system. No irregularity was detected. Yes, Deputy Director. About the individual yacht travel scheme, let me go through the procedures for a visiting vessel to come to Hong Kong. To facilitate activities of vessels across the boundary. Last year, we signed a facilitation measure for pleasure vessel with the Marine Department's permit. The coxswain can drive the licensed vessel to Hainan province in the mainland waters. Now, for the vessel outside of Hong Kong, in order to enter Hong Kong waters, they need to go through certain procedures, including the Department of Health, Immigration Department, Marine Department, as well as the Customs and Excise Department. If cargo or passenger customs clearance is needed before the vessel is allowed to be berthed at the marina or at the Typhoon shelter in Hong Kong. Mr. Yu referred to blue tourism. Perhaps if we still have time, if I could defer to the Assistant Commissioner for Tourism to take this question. Yes, how about giving them 1 more minute from the Culture, Sports and Tourism Bureau, please? The CST Bureau works closely with the industry and the tourism board to disseminate the latest information to tourists. For tourist attraction with elements of fisherman culture, water-friendly tourist attractions, etc., you will find this information on our website. For example, in the vicinity of Aberdeen Typhoon Shelter and also the Causeway Bay Typhoon Shelter, we mount a publicity campaign. And also for the heritage tour, it contains elements of the fisherman's culture, such as freshwater marine culture. The itinerary also includes a visit to the stilt houses in Tai O. We encourage the industry to include more elements of water-friendly tourist attractions in the itinerary for visitors to know more about the water-friendly culture of Hong Kong. There was a question just now on night vibes and enhanced publicity for typhoon shelters. Starting in September, different government departments and different organizations already ran night markets along waterfront promenades, respectively in Kennedy Town, Wan Chai, and Kwun Tong. And again, you'll find publicity of these attractions on the website of Tourism Board. In July, the Hong Kong Tourism Board also organized a similar festival at the waterfront promenade. So much about our publicity. Next, Mr. Paul Chair, thank you for letting me have a go first. Chairman, I thank the deputations for coming, but I am disappointed. I mean, the administration responded to the views expressed, but I think they are just reading out from their line to take. I don't think that they are truly responding to the questions and views expressed. Chairman, I don't know if you're happy with their answers. I, for one, am not. We have a beautiful coastline. We have valuable resources. I think we are letting them go to waste. If you consider the issues expressed as issues happening on the land, then it's really astonishing. You talked about poor management of berthing spaces, improper handling of large refuse, waste oil, pleasure crafts being used as guest houses, the typhoon shelter being inaccessible by fireboats. I I would find this totally unacceptable. It seems the typhoon shelters is the backwater. Well, I think that the Marine Department is really performing poorly. Some improvements were made after the Lamma Island vessel collision, but that's it. You're just reading from your script. You are not taking the user's perspective in finding solutions to problems. You just keep on using excuses. You say that you will conduct consultation. I understand that the government officials always have the line to take. You can't divulge more information. But even if you're unable to answer our question, you can tell us. You go back and give it some thought. Don't just give a perfunctory response. Well, I think there is a consensus that there is a shortage of berthing spaces in typhoon shelters, and yet you come up with answers like 80-90% utilization rate. This is clearly poor management, because berthing spaces, this is unlike a parking space in a car park. You don't see lines. What happens is a large vessel takes up multiple spaces and other vessels cannot take refuge there. So it seems that we have a parallel universe here. Perry and I are familiar with East Kowloon, and Kowloon Typhoon Shelter Kuntong Typhoon Shelter is one good example. When we were young, in Jordan Road, in Yao Chimong, we often see thugs taking up parking spaces. You can only get a space if you pay for it. Why is it that we stamp out the problems on land but not at sea? Why do you still allow people to illegally occupy berthing spaces? Why do you still find it acceptable after all these years for pleasure crafts to be used as guest houses, for people to use as a form of accommodation? I don't think you have answered any question put by the industry here. I don't want to go through every point. I just feel that you are not facing the problem squarely. Director of Marine, other government officials, please do some soul searching. Please think from the perspective of fishermen and other stakeholders. Make good use of our invaluable marine resources. Our resources are dwindling. Our stock market is plummeting. So you need to tap new sources, find new opportunities for Hong Kong, for fishermen, especially those who live on marine resources. You should improve management of the resources. Otherwise, if you allow illegal occupation to go on like this, if you allow problems to drag on, this just doesn't work. If you don't devise short, medium, long-term measures, it would be futile to have meetings here.
Any response from the government? Undersecretary? Thank you, Chairman. And I would like to thank Mr. Chase for his criticism. We hear that, and we will go back to see how we can improve on our work. But I would like to clarify one point on illegal activities in oceans. That is unacceptable for us as well. It's not the case that because it happens on the ocean, it's acceptable. We will step up our enforcement action and improve in this area. Thank you. It's my turn. We can extend the meeting if there are any further questions. I would like to thank the government for coming. I'm happy to see that so many government departments are here. It means that the government attaches importance to the issues. I hope that the government understand why we have this subcommittee. It's because we have so many issues. When I recommended for the establishment of this subcommittee, we wanted to talk about marine economy and the management overall. But because there are so many issues, we could not discuss all of them in a single year. That is why we restrict the subcommittee to study matters relating to typhoon shelters, including issues relating to shelter spaces and the conflicts of different industries. There is a consensus among different deputations that is insufficient sheltered spaces. As mentioned by Mr. Chair, the government says that they discover no illegal activities. They said they made 17 prosecutions, but the penalties was only $1,000. I hope to urge the government to handle the problems and to identify solutions. And we also talk about if the government has enough power to enforce legislation. I have a few questions for the government. Does the government or the Marine Department have the power to allocate berthing spaces for different vessels? Can you move any vessels? Second, the government always say that they act on experience, but sometimes we can foresee issues for artificial islands and third runway projects. When there are works vessels. I think that you should have foreseen that. You should not only act when there is problems and improve it in the future. And sometimes the improvement was not done very properly. The government usually acts on code of practice and they act on past experience and in accordance with the marine legislation or ordinance. That's not what we want to see. Why is it the case that some typhoon shelters have occupancy rate lower than 100%? As a fisherman, because of historic reasons, there were some areas that were designated as typhoon shelters. As Shuttlecock, that is SA8. The depth of the waters is not enough for sampans, but is still classified as a typhoon shelter. That is SA8. Because of historic reasons, there are a lot of fishermen there. When the tides goes, the fishing boats capsized or go ashore. I hope that you can improve on this area. And there are some deputations who suggest the government engaging consultant to look at the needs of typhoon shelters. I have a set of paper at hand conducted by the government. I think that they've spent maybe $1 million, but the result of the report was not up to standard because they always say that there is enough parking or berthing spaces. The reason for the discrepancy in comments is because the government only look at the figures. Different industries has different needs. Just now, some deputations say that they have to serve the public during typhoon number 8 and they can only come back to the typhoon shelters after that. The demand for different users of the typhoon shelters are different. But because of the principle of fairness, the government only allow a first come, first served basis for allocation of typhoon sheltered spaces. I think that the government should take into account the needs of different industry. We have a Thai Park seafood restaurant, and Mr. Zimmerman also suggests constructing typhoon shelters in different places, including Yau Tong Bay. And Mr. Yik also mentioned the issues relating to Cheung Kwan O. I think that in Yau Tong Bay we can have a marina bay and recreational fisheries. Because the space there is limited, so it's difficult to turn that into a water sports recreational club. I think that we can do that in Cheung Kwan O. Some of those places are fishing area. There are fishermen fishing there. We cannot just rely on the Transport and Logistics Bureau. The Marine Department only talks about safety, and they don't care about economic development. For invigorating Island South Office and the Culture, Sports and Tourism Bureau say that we should look for Marine Department when there is issues relating to marine. I think that all the bureaus and department there should collaborate and look at what improvements that are to be done. I think that maybe you can engage the Chief Secretary for Administration to oversee the matter. The Culture and Sports and Tourism Bureau can only look after only certain issues. Undersecretary, please. As to whether or not we are empowered to designate berthing spaces for vessels, may I defer to the Marine Department to take that question. As Mr. Ho and a number of LegCo members have mentioned, why does the industry think that there is insufficient berthing space in Typhoon shelter, and why we think that there is enough according to our report? I think that the chairman has pinpointed the core of the issue, because the vessel users only use the Typhoon shelters that are suitable for them, and we look at the overall figures. I think that we should study that further in accordance with the needs of different users. Usually for the Typhoon shelters inside the Victoria Harbour, because of the protection of the Harbour Ordinance, there is little that can be done, but we can legislate maybe to empower the Director of Marine to manage the use of Typhoon shelter. That could be our way out. As to whether or not there is space to construct berthing spaces or Typhoon shelters outside Victoria Harbour, we can consider that. Marine Department, please. If you need the Legislative Council to help you, you can tell us. Thank you. In accordance with the laws, the Director of Marine can ask the vessels to berth at some designated areas, but we have to tread very carefully when we invoke such legislation. We have adopted some administrative arrangement for designation of berthing areas. For Cheung Chau and Aberdeen, we have done such pilot schemes. If there is such needs in other Typhoon shelters, we can do that, perhaps in Cheung Chau, as mentioned by some deputations. We will continue to designate different berthing areas in Typhoon shelters through administrative arrangement to better manage the Typhoon shelters. Thank you. The Marine Department has the power to designate berthing space for different vessels, but they tread very carefully when they invoke the legislation. Sometimes fishermen see some vessels berthing horizontally, blocking the passageway, and they could reach out to the Marine Department so that they can remove the vessels. Some deputations say that some vessels take up the space for a long time. Thank you. Second round, Mr. Yik, please. I will extend the meeting by 15 minutes. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. The government still says that the administrative arrangement is effective. There are two things that the deputations have said, including the poor management of Typhoon shelters and the insufficient berthing spaces in Typhoon shelters. I think that the government should legislate to empower the Director of Marine to remove certain vessels. The government says that there is no irregularities spotted in Kwun Tong Typhoon shelters because there is no ordinance governing that. We cannot illegally occupy a parking space for someone else and charge them money. How could that happen in the ocean? I have a few follow-up questions. I will no longer talk about if we have enough berthing spaces and typhoon shelters. I hope that you can take into account the geographical location and the occupancy rate of the typhoon shelters during typhoon. You cannot just look at the overall size of the typhoon shelters to see if there is enough berthing spaces. You mentioned that in Hailing Chao typhoon shelters, you have constructed a 700-meter long concrete pontoon floating barriers. And point number 8, you said that you will build landing facilities for typhoon shelters. But the Motorboat Association mentioned in the written submission that the chief executive says that we should build landing facilities in different typhoon shelters. Sometimes there is no rail or handrails, and the staircases are slippery. On expansion of typhoon shelters, I support that. And you also mentioned that during typhoon, the works vessels can berth at typhoon shelters. I support that as well. On point 15, on the issues of 70-meter long vessels, I will not repeat that. On point 17, you said that you will encourage suitable sized pleasure vessels in Area B to move to Area A. You said that you encourage instead of asking or mandating. On point 24, you talked about collection of waste oil and collection of refuge. You say that you will explore that. I think that you should work on it instead of exploring the feasibility. Point 30, on irregularities. Some vessels were leased as guest houses. There are 17 of such cases. There are some residential vessels that are berthed in typhoon shelters with electricity and water connected. I urge the Marine Department to follow up on that. I'm sure that the figure is not as low as mentioned in your paper, because it also involves navigational safety. I will not talk about the wreckage of typhoon shelters. You said that you will handle that. I think that you should legislate as well. If you just act in accordance with the prevailing ordinance to ask the vessels operators to clear their vessels, I think that you should empower the government to clear the wreckage first. On the impact of spells on Ma Wan fishing raft, it seems that you say that there is nothing that could be done, because when there is large vessels going near Ma Wan, then there swells is inevitable. I don't see any solutions.
易議員好多問。
Mr. Yik asked a lot of questions. Who would like to take his questions, please? Undersecretary, how about you give an overall response, and then the technical questions, Marine Department can take them. Well, we thank Mr. Frankie Yik for the comments. I will see if it's possible to make improvements. This is the purpose of attending today's meeting. We'd like to gauge the views of the trade. Perhaps the Marine Department can take the other more technical question, please. About the assessment of typhoon shelter space requirements, we just finished this round, and there should be sufficient shelter space until 2035. The next round will begin in 2025. We've noted your views, and you'll be consulted in the next round of assessment. Next, I'd like to tell members about the effectiveness of the concrete floating pontoon floating barriers. In 2023, the construction was completed, and then in summer, some typhoon struck, such as Typhoon Saola on the 1st of September, and then another typhoon in October. Afterwards, we liaised closely with the CEDD. Divers were dispatched to check the breakwater. Now, earlier, 2 devices were placed subsea to gauge the effectiveness. After Typhoon Saola struck Hong Kong, the diver was asked to visit the place again, and it shows that the structure was effective in minimizing the impact of swells to the area within the typhoon shelter. I can give you more details after the meeting. Now, about landing steps, during the Marine Department's patrol, we'll check the landing steps as well. We will report any fault to the Port Division of the CEDD, which is the Works Department for the maintenance and repair of the hardware, that is the landing steps. All right, I am the last to speak. I still have a lot of questions, but first of all, I thank Mr. Frankie Yik for. Right, you still have some more questions? Please be brief. Mr. Yu. The Marine Department already responded to the question on the individual yacht travel scheme about the criteria for the yachts from the Greater Bay Area to come to Hong Kong. How many yachts have come to Hong Kong under the scheme? About vessels exceeding 75 meters in length, they are barred from entering our typhoon shelters. Now, is it the same for other countries? Is it possible for our rules to be relaxed so that larger vessels can enter our typhoon shelters as well? Now, can you first take this question on vessels exceeding 75 meters in length? Mr. Law? Because of the limited size of the typhoon shelters, we must impose length restrictions. We design the typhoon shelters according to the vessels in operation, their activities and demand. That accounts for the length restriction. That means excessively large vessels cannot use the typhoon shelter because they may block emergency access by fireboats. Now, for vessels exceeding 75 meters in length, when they apply for a license with the Marine Department, the ship owners will be required to submit a proposal on refuge arrangements. For larger vessels, they can take refuge at open sea, free of obstruction. I don't think the question has been answered. He didn't answer me directly. I'm asking whether other places have a similar restriction of 75 meters. If we are to build new typhoon shelters, will you consider providing larger berths to accommodate larger vessels? Well, I think that larger vessels may also be affected by the depth of sea. They cannot come near the shore if the seabed is not deep enough. So different countries may have different limitations. Let me just quickly supplement this point. For typhoon shelters in Hong Kong, we are affected by the annual typhoons in the West Pacific. So that's how our typhoon shelters are designed. I'm afraid we cannot make comparisons with other places. As for the yacht individual visit scheme, they must first apply for a permit to ply the waters of Hong Kong with the Marine Department. Since they are not licensed in Hong Kong, they need to apply for a permit, in other words. We began issuing permits in 2009. There were 9 permits to start with. And then in 2021, 653 were issued. And then in 2022, 450 were issued. From 2009 to September 2023, 2,375 permits have been issued. All right, so much for the figures. I'm the last to speak. Mr. Frankie Yik asked some questions, including Ma Wan. The government is mapping out a blueprint for the development of sustainable development of fisheries industry. Now we need to ask the EEB whether a marine culture zone would be set up there. If the answer is yes, they will need to build a breakwater to keep the place from treacherous water. Now, about the illegal occupation of berthing spaces, they can then charge others for the adjoining spaces. This is not allowed, so we should tackle such a problem because they are exploiting public resources for private gains. We don't want to see something like the local bullies occupying parking spaces on the road again, because this goes against your objective. Supposedly, anyone can use the berth, but the problem is the vessel is berthed there, and the adjoining berths cannot be used. That's how they occupy the berths. Also about Kwun Tong Typhoon Shelter, supposedly there are designated areas. Pleasure vessels, however, continue to occupy the berths. You have a set of guidelines. If they refuse to take orders from you, will there be any penalty? In the past decade, did you invoke this piece of legislation? We need to find out if a legal framework is available. For vessels exceeding 75 meters in length. Now, for larger vessels, they will find their own way. We don't have many large vessels in Hong Kong. The number reduced from 20 to 15, and the number may further dwindle. We have limited marine resources. The government should consider restricting the number of licenses. We cannot allow just allow large vessels to be built infinitely. About the wreckage, like Mr. Yu said, the government should review whether the wreckage should be salvaged before recovering the cost from ship owners. Well, this is food for thought for you, because perhaps fishing vessels will need to take out third-party insurance policies as well, because the same is adopted for vehicles. Motor vehicles are required to take out a third-party insurance, and perhaps the 3% should be charged as the third-party insurance, only that this will lead to an increase in licensing cost. If this is done, we can make sure valuable resources are vacated for other purposes, because otherwise the matter will have to be taken to court, and I'm afraid this will take up your time. And this is costly as well. So please consider the insurance point. About the CST Bureau, pardon me, but you may not be very familiar with what happens at sea. You tell me about the night vibes, but the Victoria Harbour is just a backdrop for your activities. You are for people to sell siu mai there, for retail activities to happen at the waterfront. We need to have a vibrant harbour for this to happen. At this moment, they need to pay the triads to use the berths, and they're driving away the vessels. The Hong Kong Tourism Board may have a lot of information on the website. It's just a click away, but do you really know the details? That is why we're calling for this meeting, so that we have regard to the interests of the general public, so that those engaged in this trade will not be the last group to get a dividend. I hope that report can be made available as quickly as possible, so that you can tell us a roadmap and a timetable. One more minute, Mr. Frankie Yik. I'd like to respond to the Undersecretary's remarks. Is it that we cannot do anything about the Victoria Harbour because the government is minded to relax the rules, so to speak? Now, and even under the Protection of Harbour Ordinance, when there are overriding needs, some projects can go ahead. For example, if we need to consider people's lives and property, then must we always say no to the idea of an additional breakwater? Do give it a thought. Now, what about the floating deck and other issues? Now, we're talking about typhoon shelters today. I will follow up on these issues on other occasions. I thank the deputations for coming today. Item 2, date of next meeting and items for discussion. You'll be informed in due course by the Secretariat. Next, any other business? Nothing under AOB. That's all. Meeting's adjourned.